To make our soups, we'll need a nice sauce pot, a wooden spoon for stirring, a ladle for serving, and in the process of making, we'll need liquid measuring cups, dry measuring cups, measuring spoons, a straight edge spatula, and depending on the recipe, we'll need a knife and cutting board, or you may even want to consider using a mini chopper for some tasks, a small food processor. To make our loaded potato soup, we will need potatoes that have been cooked and then peeled and cubed. We'll need margarine or butter, chopped onion, flour, milk, sour cream, cheddar cheese, salt and pepper to taste, and if you would like for garnish, bacon bits and additional shredded cheddar cheese. To begin our potato soup, we're going to melt our margarine over medium heat in our sauce pot. Once that has completely melted, we'll add our onion and saute that for a minute or two before adding any more ingredients. So as we saute our onions over a medium heat, we have about a minute left. I want to discuss the soups that are being demonstrated in this video. So the soups in this video are thick soups. They tend to be a more creamy soup, thick soups do. And they are soups like broccoli cheese, loaded potato, chowders like corn chowder, clam chowder, and cream soups like creamy mushroom soup. These are very different than the other two categories of soups, broth soups and specialty soups. Broth soups or clear soups are more along the line of things like chicken noodle and vegetable beef soups. Broth soups, as I mentioned, fit into the clear category. And another common favorite among the broth soups is minestrone. And then the third category of soups, specialty soups, includes soups like gazpacho, which is typically served cold, vichyssoise, and even things like borscht are examples of specialty soups. Alright, so I've reached the time where my onions are finished sauteing. So I'm going to go ahead and add my flour, and then I want to cook that in the fat for just a minute to cook that starch flavor. So this is like making a white sauce basically that we're going to add our other soup ingredients to. So we want to cook this for just about a minute. Really get some good bubbles going in the pan so we know that that starch, that raw starch flavor is cooking out of the flour. And then once that time has passed, we'll add our milk. So just about 30 more seconds here. So when you're cooking your soups, you really want to consider anything that uses stock to use a quality stock. And when you're choosing that, remember that meats add flavor to stock, but bones add body. In this recipe, we are using a starch to thicken the liquid, and that's why our liquid will need to come to a boil. So our flour is our starch in our potato soup here. So my flour has finished cooking. Now I'm going to add part of my milk. Give that a good stir. Add the rest of my milk. And make sure I go over the entire surface of the pan when I'm stirring. And I'll be stirring pretty constantly to make sure that none of it burns to the bottom. So we're partially through cooking the milk and flour together and bringing this to a boil. It is important to make sure that you stir across the entire surface of your pan so that nothing can sit on the bottom and burn in any one spot. But you can see that currently our mixture in our pan is still very liquidy. It's not that steamy just yet, and we definitely do not have a boil, and it's really important that this boils to thicken properly. So we'll continue to cook and stir, and you have to stir continuously to make sure it doesn't burn. So we'll continue to cook and stir for a few more minutes. So as I stir my soup, I can feel that the liquid is a little bit thicker. The spoon moves through it a little differently. It's more viscous. You can see along the sides of the pan where it's starting to thicken. So I'm going to scrape that back down into the main body of the liquid. And I'm going to just pause here for a second to see if I see the bubbles for boiling, because sometimes it takes that. So you can see that it is starting to boil. So now that I've got that, it's a little bit thicker. You can kind of see that on the back of the wooden spoon. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my potatoes. Just one more stir here to make sure I'm keeping everything from collecting on the bottom, because that would burn. And we'll carefully add our potatoes. We want to cook that for about, so we'll carefully add our potatoes, and we'll cook that for about 5 minutes on a medium heat. I want to set a timer so I don't let it go too long. And at this point, I'll only have to stir occasionally, not constantly. Now that my 5 minutes have passed, you can see I have a nice creamy soup with lots of chunks of potato. But I personally prefer a smoother potato soup. So I'm going to turn the heat down just a little bit. And I'm going to take a potato masher and just try to mash some of those cubes of potato into the soup to smooth it out a little. And once I finish that, we'll go on to the next step. Once you have your soup to the consistency that you like, we're going to turn the heat down, if you have not already, to low or a medium low. And we're going to add our sour cream. And about a cup or a shredded cheddar cheese for flavor. Salt and pepper to taste. So a little bit of pepper ground in there. Just a little bit of salt. And I would not add any more of those until you had tasted your soup with a separate tasting spoon. You should never taste anything that you're making with your stirring spoon, but a separate spoon that gets washed between taste, or a new spoon each time. If you needed to keep this warm, you could set it to the side with a lid on it, and you would be able to keep it warm for probably 30 minutes, maybe a little better. But I would be cautious about leaving heat on, so that if you do that, you're going to have to make sure you stir it regularly so that it doesn't burn to the bottom. But if you just set it to the side off the heat with the lid, it'll stay nice and warm for a while. If you find your potato soup gets a little too thick, you can always add another dash or two of milk to thin it back down to the right consistency. For our broccoli cheese soup, we'll need chopped onion, margarine, flour, water, bouillon, chicken bouillon, garlic powder, pepper, frozen broccoli that's been chopped and thawed, milk, half and half, and American cheese. To begin our broccoli cheddar soup, we're going to melt our margarine and saute our chopped onion in that melted margarine for about 5 minutes until our onion is almost tender. Originally, this recipe calls for 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons of chopped onion. Now, the people that I will be serving with this particular recipe are not necessarily big fans of prominent onion flavor, but to leave the onion out altogether would really be a disservice to the overall flavor of the soup. So instead, what I've done is I've reduced it, and I did just 2 tablespoons of onion, which also means my onion is cooking a little bit faster. So I'm not going to need quite the whole 5 minutes to saute it, because I definitely don't want to burn it. I don't want it to turn brown. I just want to get a nice flavor developed, sauteing the onion in the butter or margarine. So now that my onion is where I want it to be, I'm going to go ahead and add my flour. And I'm going to cook and stir that until it's completely blended. And I want to stir this for about a minute to cook that raw starch flavor out. Really important when you make a roux, which is basically what we've got here. You can see the flour mixture is really bubbling, and that shows you that the starch flavor is cooking out of that. So that's plenty of time. Now I'm going to add my water and bouillon, pepper, and garlic powder. And I'm going to stir that bring this to a boil, and then I'll be ready for the next. So I'm going to continue to cook and stir my flour, water, bouillon mixture over a medium heat until it comes to a boil. And then I'll be ready to add the broccoli and let it simmer for about 10 minutes. Now that my broccoli soup mixture has come to a boil, I'm going to add my thawed broccoli to the pan and let that simmer for about 10 minutes. And I'll want to set a timer for that and keep an eye on it and stir occasionally through that 10-minute time period. It's important to note that since our broccoli was added cold, we need to allow the entire pan to come back to a simmer before we start timing it for that 10-minute period. Now that our broccoli's had about 10 minutes to simmer and cook the broccoli itself to a nice doneness, we're going to stir in our creamy liquids, our milk, and our half and half. And then we're going to stir in our cheese. And once that's melted, we'll be ready to serve. Now, if you found this to be a little too thin and you wanted it to be a little bit thicker, you could add a slurry of cornstarch and cold water, about a tablespoon of cornstarch and a 1/4 cup of cold water. Stir those together, and then you could add that and stir it until it was heated through, and it would thicken your soup. So we're just going to add our cheese, and on that same low heat, get that melted, and then we'll be ready to serve our broccoli cheddar soup. So now that my cheese is melted, I can see the consistency of my broccoli soup, and it's a little bit thinner than I would prefer to have it. So I've taken a tablespoon of cornstarch and stirred it with a fork into a 1/4 cup of cold water. So we're just going to add that. And let that cook through. And that should add some nice thickness to our soup after a couple of minutes. So after adding the cornstarch slurry, I brought my soup back to a boil and let it boil for a minute or two. And that added a nice thickness to the soup. And if you were still not quite satisfied, you could always repeat that step with the slurry again. You just want to take time in between to really examine what it does so that you don't overdo it. For our cream of mushroom soup, or creamy mushroom soup, we'll need margarine, mushrooms, garlic cloves, flour, chicken broth, milk, salt, nutmeg, and pepper. To get started on our creamy mushroom soup, I've melted the butter and margarine in the bottom of the pan, and now we're going to add our mushrooms and garlic and cook and stir those for about 5 minutes. Now that my garlic and mushrooms have had about 5 minutes that I've been stirring and cooking, I'm going to add my flour, and I want to stir that for about a minute to make sure that that raw starch gets cooked out. And then we're going to add our chicken stock and our milk to our creamy mushroom soup. So this is all being done over a medium heat. That's a 5 or a 6. So a little more here to make sure that I cook all that flour. So it can really thicken the soup properly. And we're going to add our chicken stock. Part of it. Add a little more. There we go, that's the rest of our chicken stock. And now we'll add our milk. And again, we're stirring this pretty constantly so that nothing burns to the bottom of the pan. And I'm going to reduce my heat to low. So first I'm going to bring it to a simmer. And then once it begins to simmer, I'm going to reduce my heat to low and set a timer to simmer it for about 5 minutes. Now that my mushroom soup has had a chance to cook at a simmer for about 5 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and add those remaining spices and herbs. and stir those in, and then it'll be ready to serve. Here we have our nice, thick, creamy soups, broccoli cheese soup, loaded potato soup, and creamy mushroom soup, ready to enjoy and warm you up on a cold day.